Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Ned Lilly, President and CEO of xTuple, an ERP software that backs to the legendary PostgreSQL database. Our theme today is ERPs and entrepreneurship. Now, Ned, before I have you introduce yourself and tell us a little about you, I have a question.
Fire away.
It is the end of the world. We're talking Walking Dead, okay? Zombies everywhere. You have the option of staying in town or going to an island that completely will sustain you. You can bring nobody, no pets. It's just you. You're it. You are the last man standing. What three items do you bring to the island?
That's assuming I choose to go to the island, right?
Well, you're the last best man standing. Somehow I feel the self-preservation. You'll go for the island.
What three items? Well, gosh.
Well, Ned, it looks like you're dead.
That didn't take too long.
So for our listeners, my three items are very simple. It would be a fire starter, a knife, and a cup. The reason is that once you get a fire started, if you maintain it, you very rarely use the fire starter, and it's a whole heck of a lot easier than a bow drill. The knife, you can hunt, you can fish, you can create shelter, you can chop wood, and a cup so you can boil water because you never want to drink water from the wild without boiling it first.
That's outstanding. You're basically John Locke from Lost.
I don't know about that, but I spend quite a bit of time outdoors. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit outside of your title here to tell us who you are and what you do.
Name's Ned Lilly. Live in Virginia. I went to undergrad at the University of Virginia, was an American government major, have a master's in something called political management of all things, and had a brief first career doing that kind of stuff in and around the nation's capital, and kind of lost my taste for it pretty quickly. Got interested in technology in the early kind of pre-internet days of dial-up, CompuServe, and America Online, and Prodigy even, and was just really interested in how people were using technology to sort of better their own lives, and kind of how they were doing a better job of that than the people that I was trying to get elected into government. So those two lines kind of crossed on the graph for me, and I just got more and more interested in technology, and ended up working for a company that was a media company that had sort of periodic fits of entrepreneurial activity over the years, starting up things and doing kind of corporate venture type investing, and ended up sort of almost by default being the go-to technology guy on the corporate staff for that sort of thing. So that's how I kind of got to where I was. And then several years later, I decided I wanted to start my own company, and that's the company that became xTuple.
Political management. So
it just sounds dirty, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, actually, that leads to my question: was how many showers a day did you have to take to actually get through a week being in political management?
It was an interesting time. I sort of split my time. There was here's more technology stuff. In the early days of again, sort of pre-internet, there was a business called the Hotline, which is now owned by National Journal, and it was basically a kind of a cross between a clipping service and a digest of all of the political news around the country. And we had a bank of modems stacked up on top of each other, probably, I don't know, a couple dozen anyway. And all the political reporters from all around the country would either like send us their stories, plain text, 80 columns directly over the modem, or sometimes they'd fax them, and we would assemble it all into this sort of digest overnight, and send it out over those modems directly to each individual subscriber. the next morning at, 8 a.m. So it was a great job for 20 somethings that didn't need to sleep much. But
I tell, I tell you
yes.
what, that's fascinating because, I remember you and I came up around the same time, and I remember, you mentioned CompuServe, which would be, the equivalent today without the access would be, say, LinkedIn. And Prodigy and AOL were kind of the same thing. And then you had, the Linux of the online services, which was the one that I used, was Delphi.
I remember Delphi. Yeah.
And, I actually founded the largest still operating private ISP in Portland, Oregon. Not the company, but that segment of their business. And they're still operating today.
Wow.
And I was selling, that started as, they brought me in as a bench tech. And, for those that don't know, there was a time when computer makers didn't think about the idea that you could put a CPU in the wrong way. So the CPUs would be symmetrical. And if you didn't know how to put them in, you could put them in sideways, turn on the computer, and blow up the CPU. That's how I learned which direction to put the CPUs in. But I was selling, 486 DX266s with 16 meg of RAM and a 1 gig SD or SCSI drive, depending on the buyer, for $5,000 a pop.
Oh yeah. Before the Pentium revolution.
Before the Pentium revolution, back when Cyrix was a thing. And so it's been a long time. So you founded xTuple, but you had a life kind of briefly between being what most people don't like to talk about, but love to talk about, which is politics, and xTuple, and that was Great Bridge. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the media company I mentioned, kind of medium size family business called Landmark Communications, based in Virginia. And, as I referenced these spasms of entrepreneurial activity, they had done things like started the Weather Channel cable network from scratch. The Auto Trader classified magazines, autotrader.com, and all was something they jointly started with Cox Enterprises out of Atlanta. So, an interesting company for someone that was basically a newspaper and TV station company. But they had this sort of venture group that I was in that did these interesting things from time to time. And one of the things they did was an ISP. Actually, they started up. They bought a small company that basically provided dial-up internet to the communities they serviced with their newspapers. And then they brought Gannett and Knight Ridder into it, and it became a decent-sized national ISP for a little while. And lo and behold, they, without knowing it, were one of the largest users of Red Hat Linux back in the day. This is sort of early mid 90s. And so when Bob Young was running around looking for investors in the early days of Red Hat, he came to Norfolk, Virginia, and talked to Landmark. And they fair to say they didn't get the idea of open source. And it was actually it's a family business. The father was running the company at the time. The son was actually running the ventures group at the time. And so when the company passed on it, he kind of raised his hand and said, "Anybody mind if I, put a couple million of my own into this Red Hat thing?" And everyone sort of laughed and said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." So that guy, Frank Batten Jr., ended up becoming the largest single shareholder in Red Hat and turned a couple of million into a couple of billion. And, the rest, as I say, is history. So fast forward several years, and I'm back on the corporate staff and sitting in my little cubicle. And Frank comes and sticks his head around the corner and says, "Hey, Ned, I'd like you to find me another Red Hat." And I said, "Well, okay." So looked at a lot of stuff, and it kept coming back to, obviously, you think about the technology stack, and there's your operating system, and most people would say the database is sort of the next step up. And Just kept coming back to this Postgres database. Really seemed to have a lot of potential. Wasn't super well known at the time. I'd actually used it in a couple of my little companies inside of Landmark. There was a vacation rental properties business that we built from scratch that used it. One of the other publishing businesses. So anyway, we put together, I wrote a business plan for this company called GreatBridge. And we actually brought the core team, the core Postgres team together in person for the first time. These guys never met each other in person. So it was Bruce, Tom, Jan, Mark, Thomas, and Vadim, the original 6, got together for a weekend in San Francisco, and it was really cool. And 3 of the 6 of them ended up joining this startup that we created. And it was interesting. It had a lot of potential. I think by any stretch, any definition, it was pretty early for that kind of business. But at the end of the day, I think there was a lot of internal disagreement, shall we say, about just the fundamentals of the business model. I know you had some experience with them back in the day, and they ended up just closing the doors after less than a year.
Yeah, they actually created Command Prompt as it is today. Story is that Command Prompt was just a small shop doing web development, Linux administration, those types of things. And at the time, I was actually, I made most of my money doing Citrix terminal server consulting. But we were doing a lot of PostgreSQL. It's just the database that landed in our lap. It wasn't any particular choice at the time. But we needed someone just in case, right? Because business was growing. We had customers that were relying on for critical infrastructure, which frankly at that time was probably a bad choice. But we wanted to be able to call someone and say, hey, we just got something weird happen. Can you help us? And GreatBridge quoted us $15,000 for a year just for the possibility that we might call them. Now, if you're Oracle, that might make sense. If you're a company with 0 market share using a software that is unknown by anybody but the geekiest of geeks, that it's kind of a bad business plan. And which is kind of interesting because, as Command Prompt is actually the last living original Postgres company. Everybody else has either been swallowed or has gone away. And we've actually survived through all of it. It was an interesting time. I think you would agree. That was back when you couldn't run PostgreSQL 24/7. You just couldn't. It was too limited. And it had weird things like, we still have the vacuum issue, of course, but back then it was a blocking. There was no lazy vacuum.
Yeah.
And all backups, were logical. It wasn't even until relatively recently that we could correctly back up PostgreSQL in terms of like roles and permissions and things like that. It's definitely been a ride. Now with xTuple, you guys are doing ERP. And I remember actually having a conversation with you. This was probably Linux World or OzCon, but circa like 02,
early
03.
2000. Yeah,
real early, because Command Prompt was trying to create something that we tried to hold on to and just never got out the door, which was called Clean Contact, which was similar to what you do, except that it was more generalized. We were trying to create QuickBooks for open source QuickBooks based on PostgreSQL, which is not really ERP. So tell us a little bit about xTuple and why you chose PostgreSQL. Because there were other databases, and what without getting salesy, what do you think the value proposition is there?
Yeah, well, it definitely grew out of the GreatBridge experience, and without getting too far in the weeds, the fundamental kind of disagreement the parties we all had internally was whether we were going to be more of a product company or a service company. And if it was going to be a service company, was there anything more than trying to sell those $15,000 contracts and so you could have half an hour of Tom Lane's time. That didn't strike me as particularly scalable. But I did find all these people that had started building applications on top of Postgres. In some cases, pretty mission critical applications, and actually including a couple of ERP systems that were out there. And there was one in particular that the guy who wrote it was super smart. He called it Open MFG at the time. It was
I remember that.
Focused on manufacturing companies, obviously, and it was. But an ERP sort of definitionally is almost baked into the definition is one database, right? So it is the accounting stuff you were talking about, but also sales and CRM and purchasing and inventory management and and shipping and receiving. And if you're a manufacturer, then all the manufacturing activity and the scheduling and the planning, lots and lots and lots of pieces, parts, and and it's a category that has been around for a while. It's pretty top heavy. So you've got your SAPs and your Oracles of the world that have sort of dominated that space. But it's been, and so pretty well understood in the global 1,000 size companies. But for the small to medium size businesses that are the overwhelming lion's share of businesses, not just in the US, but around the world, it's a lot. ERP as existed in the early 2000s was just a big, hairy, expensive mess, complicated and just, the idea of building and bringing to market an ERP that sat on top of Postgres and was built with some other open source tools right off the top, you took a lot of cost out of the equation, right? Because you didn't also have to buy an Oracle database, and back then there were all these other embedded tools that you were paying for with these kind of applications. And so along the way, we would have people, but we didn't necessarily think of being open source ourselves right at the outset, but we did like the idea of all of our customers and all of our partners having the source code and being able to, contribute to and enhance the product. And over time, we looked more and more at the virtues of having a truly free and open source kind of starter edition that really probably got at some of the same, kind of ideas that you had with, with the accounting program at Command Prompt. And that was, it was really when the company actually started to take off, when we were released. That was
Postbooks?
Correct. Postbooks. We released as open source in, let's see, I want to say 97. No, is that right?
No, it's gonna be
no, 2007. Sorry.
It's like, we're getting old.
We went back in time, the hot tub time machine, and launched some software.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I find in the community and in the economy now is that, and I think this is probably true of any generation, is that you kind of forget or don't learn the history of something.
Yeah.
And because since you don't learn the history,
right.
What was that?
The George Santayana quote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, I never really thought about it myself because I'm always someone who is trying to take, as an entrepreneur, just like yourself, smart entrepreneurs look at past mistakes, especially their own, but definitely others, to learn from them, to not repeat them so that you can be successful. And one of the things that I find interesting is that from the get-go, now you're not open source anymore, as far as I know.
Yeah, so from 2007 for I guess until about 2018, 2019, we maintained that totally free and open source Postbooks starter edition. But yeah, just a couple of years ago, we pulled back on that, and it was interesting. It was it was a fantastic way for us to get in front of a lot of people, get some other hands on the oars to help us develop the product, obviously, and help people solve their own problems, which is, kind of always been my North Star, I guess. But it as the years went by and some of the sort of central, distribution points of open source, like SourceForge, kind of came and went. And that used to be a huge source of leads for us, of customers that would download the free version and then would want to upgrade to a commercial edition that had more features, sort of the
it was your
open core
loss
business model, right? Sorry?
It was your loss leader.
Yeah, well, it didn't really cost us anything, right? But what we found in recent years is that open source by itself didn't seem to be that much of a reason for people to acquire this kind of software, that it was almost as if open source won the battle without any shots being fired. And they sort of said, well, of course we're going to have source code, because that's the way all this internet infrastructure is built now. Talk to me about the product and the business value and what it's going to do for me. And so that's why we kind of made that shift over the past couple of years.
Well, it's actually interesting to me, and one of the reasons I brought it up, I'm sure you're aware of the Elasticsearch, MongoDB, Timescale DB, where they all started open source, and then suddenly they realized what open source meant and are no longer open source. And what I mean by that is that there was this uproar over someone like an Amazon creating these hosted versions of the software and making money, and giving back or not giving back. It always, that's not really the argument, because open source doesn't require that you give back. But I'm kind of
license, right?
Say that again.
Particularly a Berkeley license.
Yeah, particularly a Berkeley license, but even GPL, right? You don't have to give back unless you change it.
Right.
Right. So you could install it on a server and put a web portal in front of it, and you have, in theory, a viable business plan that gives you monthly subscriptions. The problem is obviously then you're in theory taking money from Elasticsearch. And one of the things that I found interesting about this uproar was these are entrepreneurs that had a good idea, that got backed, had funding, and decided open source was the hot new trend, without actually educating themselves on what that meant and what the risks were. And it's not like the information isn't out there. I mean, you can look at PostgreSQL, you can look at Linux, you can look at Apache or Nginx or any of these other open source projects, the entire GNU Foundation for that matter, and see that all the money that you make there is in value add around it, and everybody is sharing. So I found that kind of interesting, that you didn't take that route, but there was a similar result, right? You said, okay, the value that we're getting from open source is no longer there. So we're going to go ahead and close source this and continue to provide a good product and a good service, and provide for our employees and their families and help our clients grow. We're not taking our ball and going home. We are just modifying our strategy to be more effective. And I'm particularly impressed with that because of how long you've been around. You had the open source bones and education and history behind you and your corporation, that these types of changes weren't unexpected. Like the fact that you can still get Postbooks. It's in app repositories, just the last version you released that was open source, right?
Yeah, it's just 4 years ago now.
Yeah, it's just 4 years ago, but you can still get it. But there's no, I guess, hard feelings, right? There's no, the big gorilla took my banana.
No, well, I think part of that's because, we started off with something that was 100% RIP, and we threw it over the fence to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there was this project out there that, a bunch of volunteers had started, and we kind of swooped in and, big evil corporate, stole it and forked it and went another direction. That actually happened to a couple of other, would-be competitors of ours back in the day in the open source ERP world. And they
Well, it
also
happened with
appeared.
Postgres too, right? I mean, if you were, do you remember Illustra?
Oh yeah.
So for those that don't know, Illustra was based off, I think it was actually Postgres 95. And it was a closed source version of Postgres. And IBM bought Illustra and turned it into what you now know as the current versions of Informix.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think it was Informix, then IBM. It was, but that was when Stonebraker was using it as a teaching tool at Berkeley.
No, you're right. It wasn't Postgres 95. It was the original Postgres. You're
Yeah,
absolutely right.
yeah,
And then there's Netezza,
yep.
Teradata. There's any number of very large organizations that take open source and never contribute back. I mean, HP was using PostgreSQL for some of their backup software for a long time. Apple used to just ship it, and no one ever complained back then. So I guess that whole uproar with the open source, the new generation of open source, which is now, I don't know what they're calling it, shared source or something like that, is they don't quite get how it works. And it's been a surprise to me, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I should be clear. I mean, we're kind of back to where we started too, in that all of our customers, all of our partners still get the full source code.
Right.
So it's not like it's all buttoned up and don't look behind the curtain. But because all of the benefits of the community of power users and people that have in our case a lot of one of the ways we built the application over the years was through different people in different types of manufacturing and distribution and other industrial type of businesses. A lot of gearheads in that world that appreciated the technology, but were also pretty deeply rooted in the blocking and tackling of what was going on the factory floor. And so we would have, as we were building out new functionality, we would have people chime in and say, well, it was really cool the way, the Bond ERP product did this, but I hate the way Oracle does this, and so we would have, and we still have this today in our, admittedly within a more of a closed community, I guess, but that collective brain power of, power users, who have a broad familiarity with lots of different systems and lots of different types of businesses. That's a skill set that we developed thanks to open source, taking all those requirements, all that feedback, and trying to sort of generalize how we build out the functionality rather than go like super narrow and say we're building a very narrow business case for people in this one industry that have all these crazy rules.
It's interesting. You said something there that's, you said closed community. And there's a price of admission to any community, and the price changes depending on what you're doing. I mean, like what there's the PostgreSQL community, which is largely what I would argue is the gearheads that you were mentioning that are hacking on PostgreSQL. And then there's the professional PostgreSQL community, which is, people Postgres data. And those are the people that are using PostgreSQL to solve problems. And the price of admission is different, right? It might be ideological, it might be talent. And in your case, I would argue, my guess is it would be a particular expertise as well as likely a client that creates your community. So with that, it seems to me that one of the things that you may be doing right is you're taking that feedback from the people that not only are using the product, because anybody can take feedback from using the product, but it's the knowledge of what the product is supposed to be doing for you that makes it so powerful.
Right.
Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, ERP is it is in a lot of ways it is among the most complex and just crazy busy type of business applications out there. It couldn't be more mission critical, right? Because it's literally running the whole company. And what happens with smaller companies, smaller companies getting started, they'll typically start off with some sort of basic accounting, like a QuickBooks or what have you. And maybe the sales guys have their own CRM, that they're off, doing their, they've got a Salesforce or HubSpot or what have you. The CFO's got a million different spreadsheets, that he's always updating, and no one else has any visibility into those spreadsheets, and then the boss's nephew wrote some little inventory management thing that, is always breaking. And, before long, you've got this company that's sort of growing up despite itself, and it's got, 3, 4, 5, 6 different business systems completely disconnected from each other. And they get to a point, particularly when they're like manufacturers or distributors, that they have these hard goods with costs associated with, making and storing and inventorying and shipping those goods. And they get to a point where they're like, I don't even know how much it costs me to make this. I don't know what I can promise my customers anymore, because all our systems are completely, a mess. And so that's the problem that ERP was designed to solve. And like I said, it's for big, huge, complex, multi-zillion dollar systems like SAP. If you're a Global 1000 company that wants to spend a couple of years implementing SAP, that's one path. But what we've been trying to do, initially through the open source approach, and now through this, what I would call more of a sort of industry focused expertise approach, is to bring that big boy ERP functionality down to smaller companies.
So I got to ask, how many zeros are in a zillion?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. With SAP, that is the correct answer. Yes. Now, there's an interesting lead off here. So xTuple only supports PostgreSQL as the database backend, correct?
Correct.
So there was I think, a forethought there that, one, because PostgreSQL was open source and growing, obviously there was a time when or you still could if you wanted, contribute directly back to through their process to get features in that would be helpful to xTuple.
Yep.
But the thing about PostgreSQL now, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, is that it's very much the Linux of databases.
I use that analogy all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you cannot buy something from Amazon without using PostgreSQL, period. Right? I mean, it's happening, as an example. And I think that when you realize that, the big bad telecommunications companies are using PostgreSQL, and so are just the little guy that has, a shopping cart or a blog that they're trying to promote. But what's most important about PostgreSQL being the Linux of databases is that it literally can do anything. Sure, you can download PostgreSQL version 14.1 or 14. I think we're on 14.2 now, from PostgreSQL.org, and you can install it and you can run it. Or you can hit a button and run, 13 on RDS Aurora, not Aurora, but on RDS Postgres, Amazon, or in Google. Or you can hire someone like a command prompt to install it and maintain it. But the more important part of this is that there are legendary pieces of software that are PostgreSQL that you don't realize.
Yep.
Like Greenplum, which, I mean, they're installed in, I don't know of any, I'm sure there are some, but I don't know of any Fortune 500 that doesn't have at least an install of Greenplum. And what we mentioned earlier, Netezza, Teradata, even though they're kind of in their swan song. And it can also be the central source of your data. if you're looking to deploy something like an ERP system, such as xTuple, and you're back to PostgreSQL, such as xTuple, any other data source you have, you can connect to PostgreSQL through any number of means, right? You
Yeah.
can have CDs, change data capture from Kafka running from your legacy Oracle into your new, and then transform it within the Kafka and then ship it right into PostgreSQL, and you never know the difference. Right.
Yeah.
And you can get off of those legacy platforms like SAP and actually move forward with your business with, a company that's actually client centric using technology that is user centric. And that would be Postgres. It's fascinating to me that we're becoming so maybe homogenized in certain data stacks. Do you think that's the right term in terms of like these core technologies that, they're the default now, right? People don't realize that 85% of the world is running Linux because 85% of the world is running Android, which is just a Linux distribution.
Yep. No, absolutely. And the analogy I use, I remember the old, the Palmolive, like green dishwasher liquid, or
yeah, it made your hands soft.
Right. Yeah. So, and the old 70s commercials where the lady in the diner was like sitting there and she had her hand literally like sitting in a little tub of the Palmolive.
That's right.
Marge, the lady in the diner, she goes, "You're soaking in it," and that's yeah. So we're all soaking in Linux and Postgres and other open source technologies without even, necessarily realizing it.
What would be the technology that's not Linux and not Postgres that we wouldn't necessarily recognize that we're soaking in?
Well, probably Siri or some of the speakers that are listening to everything we say.
Well, definitely, yeah. I mean, the Android ones, which I try to turn off, but somehow they always turn on.
Right.
You don't want to get me started on that. I'm not a big fan of. We at PostgreSConf a couple of years ago, we had Red Monk come. I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was doing the keynote about what the future is, and his argument was the future is about simplicity, right?
Yeah.
You're going to gain more users, more clients, the simpler your product is. And I agree with that. I mean, obviously, the easier a product is to use, you're lowering the barrier of entry. But there's two problems with that. Problem number one is you lower the barrier of entry, which means you get a lot more stupid users. And that may be a harsh thing to say, but the reality is there are certain people that can't even operate a Blu-ray player. Right? Whether they get frustrated or not willing to read the instructions, or they're just not able to process the way the Blu-ray player works. I'm one of those people that could never figure out how to program a VCR, no matter how hard I tried. But the
blinking
flip side,
12 o'clock at you.
What was that?
It was always blinking 12 o'clock at you.
No matter what, I could set the time. The next morning, it was still 12 o'clock. I don't know why. And largely it's because I was just too impatient to figure it out. And the lowering of the barrier of entry there obviously would make that better for me. But the flip side is then you also lower your ceiling. I think that there's this mythology that you can lower the simplicity, lower your barrier of entry and increase your ceiling of features.
Well,
but you can't.
We may make a wager here, JD, because that is in a way kind of the great enterprise that xTuple is sort of setting off on now. Because we've got this system, this ERP system, that's this big, hairy, complex thing that does hundreds of, within an ERP, you've got literally hundreds of different transactions, document types, things you do, and they're all deeply interconnected, and that complexity is a big part of why companies, only companies of a certain size and and sort of bandwidth in terms of people. It's not even necessarily dollars, but it's just their ability to engage in a project like this. It creates sort of a floor to the market for ERP systems. And so what we're engaged in now is actually putting that to the test, taking that simplicity challenge from the speaker at the conference and saying, what if we took this big hairy ERP and chopped it up into its modular pieces, and said, because over the years, I mean, we've had lots of people say to us, we really like your inventory management stuff or your manufacturing shop floor stuff, but my controller wants to keep running QuickBooks, and would that be a problem? And instead of listening to people and trying to hear what the market's telling us, we sort of crossed our arms and gave them a lecture on the value of a fully integrated ERP system,
like a true PostgreSQL community member.
Right. So and but so there is to most ERP people, there is this very real floor of size and complexity of business that can even engage with this kind of software. And depending on who you talk to, it might be a $10 million company, it might be a $5 million company, it might be a $20 million company. But and we've gone into $50, $60, $70,000 companies that are still trying to run the whole business on QuickBooks and spreadsheets. So it doesn't always directly translate to sort of revenue size, but what we're setting about now is we've built out what's really, I guess I'd say and this is the advertising portion of the programs, but we really our 4th generation API now, that takes all these different pieces of the ERP system, serves them up as a web service and says, you can just do that one thing. If you're a sales rep out in the field, you can just do these couple pieces of CRM and generate a quote for a customer. And if the rest of the company has, all the other stuff turned on back home, then you can also connect into the back end and say, and by the way, here's all the, here's the inventory that we've got available, this particular product, and here's how long it would take us to make more for you. And, that kind of value add. But so we're engaged in I'd say we're about a quarter to a third of the way through this process now of going through the full ERP and really chopping it up into what, to use a word that's probably a little old now, chopping them into microservices.
Love it. Microservices. You mean modular software components with their own individualized APIs?
Exactly.
The reason I bring that up, which why I bring this up, microservices aren't new, people. It's just what some marketing people came up with to make it sound new. It's like the cloud, right? Everybody has to be on the cloud. Everybody's been on the cloud since like 96.
Yeah, remember application service providers?
Yes, application service providers. So, good businesses, they always evolve, right? You can see a business that doesn't evolve, isn't innovating. And it doesn't mean they'll go away, right? I mean, a perfect example of this is something like IBM. They've been around for so long, they've gotten so big that instead of innovating, they just acquire.
Yep.
Right. They're not creating anything. They're buying. And for a long time, Microsoft was like this. They didn't create Excel, they bought it. Right. And then they ran with it.
I mean, in our ERP world, they didn't create Dynamics. They bought a company called Great Plains and a company called Navision.
I actually did development with Navision once upon a time in a former life, and I remember that as well.
Yeah.
And I think that to some degree, that's a problem with our society now, right? Is that we've gotten to a point where we have companies that are so big. And hey, I lean libertarian, more power to you. If you can make $1 billion, go for it. I mean, seriously, I'm not going to ask to take money from your pocket that you earned. But we have these companies that are so large that they no longer have to innovate. And to me, I know this is kind of a sidestep, but to me, that is one of the crucial points of, how do we continue forward if all we're doing is taking when the goal is no longer to innovate and provide, it is to MVP and be acquired.
Yeah.
What do you think of that thought process?
Well, I mean, it's, to bring us all the way back to my political world from the beginning of my career. I mean, that's antitrust policy. And, and that's a lot of the conversations they're having in DC about the social media companies now. And, whether they're publishers or platforms, and it's fast.
I prefer the term scavengers.
But the whole question of does Facebook have this amazing stranglehold market power over us? I'm inclined to say no. I mean, remember MySpace, remember AOL, remember, somebody can, the key question is always, have they built, these insurmountable barriers to the people that come along with a better mousetrap? And I'm not convinced that, I think in technology, that's really hard to do.
So it's interesting. Are they an insurmountable, problem? We just did a podcast with EFF, and an interesting point came up there. And this is actually, I have teenage daughters. And this is my number one, hands down, most difficult parenting conundrum is, how do I protect and parent teenage daughters against a world trying to manipulate to, what's the term? I can't remember the term, but basically turn them toward a certain brand or person,
right?
Or trafficker, those types of things, when you have these platforms like Instagram. And it's not, when you talk to a lot of younger folks, especially ones that do not have teenage children, they're like, well, you just parent, you just take the phone away or whatever. Well, that's part of the solution. But then what you've done in modern society is that you have taken away the ability for them to talk to their friends. And friends are a key component. And worse,
they call it social, right?
Yeah, it's all social. And it's a key component to being able to survive in society, is to be able to survive with people. And now in the Facebook scenario, now with teenagers, it might be a TikTok, maybe a Snapchat, and say an Instagram. Instagram nowadays it at least seems to be a little bit older. But then you have grandparents, and all the grandparents are on Facebook. So, and kids today in general, you say, text me, and they're like, what? Call me. I can't do that. That'll invoke my social anxiety. Right? But I'll direct message you. Or you take that away. So you're right.
On a platform that was built to support 130 characters.
Twitter, perfect example. Twitter's a perfect example of something that was designed to remove critical thought and discussion. And at least with Facebook, you can actually write a story that, sources and has enough words to where people have to think about what you're saying. But the real problem here is it's not that, to me anyway, it's not that they are insurmountable. It's not that someone can't come along with something better and someone may not jump to that. Okay, we've seen that. That's why, Facebook bought WeChat, or is it WeChat, or is it the other one? WhatsApp. They bought WhatsApp, and they bought Instagram, because they saw the writing on the wall. Our platform's getting stale. It's why they changed their name to Meta, which is ridiculous, but still. but they have become, if you look at the density of Google and the density of, I mean, Amazon's a social media company too, don't be fooled. But if you look at the density of Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, and the amount of information that they control, to cut one of those, you are cutting what would literally be, or not literally be, a virtual lifeline to your social structural network. So it's not as simple as just taking the phone away or setting time limits or, balancing privacy, right? It's not like the old, when you and I grew up, it was like, if you wanted to go see a friend, you picked up a phone, you went and saw a friend, or, oh my God, you got off the damn couch, walked down the street and knocked on the door. Can you imagine that today? I'm going to go see Jimmy. I'm just going to, I'll go knock on the door. That doesn't happen.
Or
You get
ride
an
my
instant
bike to his
message.
house. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Ride a bike to his house. So I would disagree with you that those platforms are not a problem. But what I
I
would
wouldn't say they
say
weren't a
is,
problem, but not, they're not invulnerable.
agreed. I mean, the market shifts as the market shifts, and they are a problem of our own creation, right? I mean, going back to your early days in politics, the people in power who are our representatives, not our leaders, people, those people that you don't like are your fault.
Yep. That's why I've never been a big fan of term limits, because we have elections every 2 years.
You're right.
Vote
And
them
actually,
out.
let's talk about, we're running short on time, but let's take a moment to talk about term limits. For a long time, I had the exact same opinion. You know what? We shouldn't have term limits because they're in power, because their constituents put them in power. And then I became relatively well known to the point where I started talking with a lot of people. The problem is that we have become a society. Well, I'll give you a perfect example. The last election. I'm not going to ask you who you voted for. It doesn't matter. But Trump, Biden, and Jorgensen. Okay, those were the three primary opportunities. You had your Republican in name, your Democrat authoritarian in name, and your libertarian, who is a PhD and would have been the first woman president. People were either A, going to vote for Trump because he's a Republican, not because he was the best choice. They were going to vote for Biden because he was a Democrat, not because was the best choice. Or they're going to vote for Jorgensen, and any number of reasons why you would vote for Jorgensen. I voted for Jorgensen because I thought she was the best choice. That's the problem with not having term limits. If you don't have term limits, it just shifts based on the nature of general feeling. I mean, this is why we have, like, the Democrats are fretting right now because the midterms are going to come up and they think they might lose their majority in the Senate, right? Or they're not literal majority. They're 50-50 in the Senate. But that's what happens every time. And that argument, that behavior there argues against term limits because the system kind of corrects itself. But then you end up in a situation where you have Nancy Pelosi, who, I mean, she's been in office as long as I've been alive.
Yep.
I'm not saying she's a good or bad politician. I didn't vote for her. She's not in my district. But she's been a politician as long as I've been alive. To me, that is an argument for term limits, because since everybody likes the term now, follow the science. So let's follow the science. When does your mental acuity start to drop?
It's a whole nother set of questions.
Well, I mean, it's true that now there is something to be said for wisdom. Absolutely. Wisdom is not intelligence, and wisdom is not necessarily mental acuity. So I don't think that we should say, okay, 65 is the cutoff. All right, necessarily. But I think that there's a real argument that our president shouldn't be 80 years old.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you on that. I'll tell you the thing, kind of closing the loop on the term limits thing. The other thing that informs me on that is having lived and worked there and known a lot of people who lived and worked there. The staff is always there, and you can't term limit them. So, with more, if you had term limits on the blow dried kind of pop-up people, that would I think in a lot of ways just make it worse, because they'd be interchangeable, but it'd still be the same people behind the scenes doing what they're doing.
That's true. I mean, the power players are the power players. And I think that a lot of people would be surprised that all these laws that are being sponsored, a lot of the representatives don't read them.
No, nobody reads them.
Right. I mean, even the Supreme Court, right? A lot of the opinions that are written, they're written by clerks through deep research. But I will say, I've always had this, I've always wanted to do this segment, like if JD was president, right? Spend 5 minutes. And for term limits, this is the way that I think about it. You can spend your life in politics, but you can only serve 2 terms in each place. So you can be in Congress for 12 years. You can be in the Senate for, I forget how long their terms are, for, I think it's 4 years.
Yeah.
Is it 6?
Yeah.
Okay, so 12 years. And you can be vice president and then president, right? For 2 terms each. That's how it would work, right? If you're actually going to choose the career path that wasn't supposed to be a career, you got to move up or out.
And then it's Logan's Run and you're dead, right?
That's right. Then it's Logan's Run and you're dead. That's exactly right. That's funny. Justin Timberlake was in a movie called No Time or No Time Left or something like that. And it's this futuristic movie where you basically have a number of credits, money, that is your life, how long you live, and you can gamble with it to live longer and things like that. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? Is like you can move all the way up the chain, but then you're dead. Yeah. So all right. Well, hey, Ned, I'm glad to catch up with you. I mean, we haven't talked in probably a decade.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Time, it does not stand still.
No, it does not. As my fact that I need a new ankle will tell you. But it's been really good to reconnect. I love talking about xTuple. We have a mutual client. Before I let you go, is there any, like, outside of the new, I guess not new product, but new version V4 of your product that you're coming out with, is there any notable use case where you have, say, solved a problem that the client didn't think that could be solved that you might want to bring up without exposing any confidential details, of course?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the more we've dug into this area of reflecting manufacturing and inventory centric expertise in the software, it just sort of it has a ripple effect throughout the user community, right? And so we have, for example, a lot, just almost by accident, we've ended up having a lot of customers in the sort of specialty food business. You think about all the companies, all the product, you walk them down the aisles in like a Whole Foods grocery store, and it's not like everything's coming from Procter and Gamble, or it's these small companies, organic stuff, and we, it's the husband and wife that want to tell you about, why they got into, making these particular food products and what have you. So we've got a lot of those customers, and some of them have gotten quite big and quite successful, on the back of our system. And like in the food world, for example, you've always got the specter of quality and recalls, if there's, God forbid, some kind of health concern. So a couple of years ago, there was an E. coli scare, and a good sized customer of ours, basically, because we have this very specialized kind of lot tracking and tracing capability in the ERP, with the FDA basically sitting on their shoulder, they were able to say, okay, the spinach that we got for, these frozen food products that are distributed through all these grocery stores across the country, we can trace back to 5 or 6 lots, original lots of the spinach that came into, to the company, to the factory. And then we track it out to all the end products, the frozen lasagnas and burritos and whatnot that are in grocers' freezers all around the country. And we can manage this recall and say, we just need to take these ones back with from these original lots that have these unique identifiers on them. And this is way before blockchain, and but it's the same concept. And manage that recall flawlessly. And happily, it was false alarm. There was no health emergency, but they were able to do it, and came out smelling like a rose with the federal government sitting on their shoulder the whole time. So I mean, it's that kind of stuff that's really cool to see companies have the success and the growth, working with us, and we can sort of feel kind of like we've been a part of that success.
Why, I would have to say that, that's a very good way to think about it. When you do business in the vein of, well, for Command Prompt, our ideology is we're farmers, right? Not hunters. So the idea is that profit is the reward for the good work. And this is what you're talking about here is a very similar thing, where even though you could argue you weren't directly involved, but I would argue you were at the center of it, right? xTuple was at the center of it, ensuring that, helping determine whether or not people were going to get sick.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well as and protecting your client from the biggest 800-pound gorilla there is.
And this is why I was so excited about doing the podcast, because the podcast about data and the people who wrangle it, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, this is those lot numbers, those ones and zeros, that's basically data that empowered this company that started off, they were $10-15 million company. They're north of 200 million now. And they've just had this crazy, fantastic growth, and they've been able to do it because they have a system that is sort of data focused. I mean, the name xTuple, there's even a geek joke baked into that, right? It's everything's coming from the tuples.
That's right.
Right. Now to regular people, we say, oh no, it means exponential growth. You double, you triple, quintuple, xtuple, right? Grow to the power of X. So it's got, two names for the price of one.
All right. With that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today was Ned Lilly, President and CEO of xTuple. Thanks for listening.